video lesson. Today is May 3rd, 2021, or it could be May 4th or May 5th, depending on whenever you're watching this. But we're going to jump into a couple things. First, announcement. Eagle Impact will be due on May 27th. You need 3 hours of community service, and anything after March 17th does count for community service. Again, community service can be anything that you do around the house, like washing the dishes, mowing the lawn, so on and so forth, planting things. If your parents need things planted for a garden, whatever, helping around the house is what we do because this is still COVID rules for Eagle Impact. Also, you can turn this in on Google Classroom or in class. So today we're going to be talking about abortion, which is always super, super fun and sometimes can get heated. And so this is not going to be arguing one side or another. This is going to be more so arguing for and more so explaining and kind of calling into your focus into the question, when does life begin? Because at the end of the day, if life doesn't begin until a certain point in the womb, then maybe abortion isn't bad and maybe abortion isn't wrong. And so that's the question that we're going to talk about today mostly. But before we get there, a couple common ideas. So 1973, Roe versus Wade legalized abortion. That was the big court case. If you have not heard of that, never heard of that, make sure you commit that to memory. 1973, Roe versus Wade, probably the most famous court case in all of U.S. history. If I'm going to pick one, I'm going to pick Roe v. Wade. You can see the pictures. These are not from Roe v. Wade, but they're pro-choice and pro-life advocates outside of governmental buildings. Another topic that gets pointed out and talked about for abortion is women's rights versus child's rights. Who should have more rights? Should it be the woman in whose body the child is growing, or should it be the child who is a living, breathing thing by some people's standards inside of the womb? Who has more rights? Who should have the rights to say what happens to them inside the womb, or what happens inside the womb? Who should have the rights there? Women's rights or the child's rights? You have a nice cute picture of a baby. A couple thoughts. About 30% of all pregnancies will end in abortion. That's from the CDC. We all know what that is now. This is a conservative estimate. Some people say maybe even close to 40%, but 30% is a conservative estimate from what I can see. However, let's note this. Abortions are on the decline in the United States. I don't know if it has to do with people getting pregnant less often. I doubt that because our population keeps increasing and the births keep increasing, so maybe not getting pregnant less often, but maybe people are deciding against abortions, or maybe the numbers of people protesting abortion clinics gets to people. Who knows? But abortions are on the decline in the United States, which is good news for people that are against abortion. Also, unmarried women account for over 85% of all abortions in 2018. And so typically people who are getting the abortions are not married. They're going to be single or maybe dating somebody, but not married. So there's a connection there. Not saying that married people don't get abortions, but there is a connection of single mothers not wanting to be single mothers and choosing and opting for abortion. A couple reasons for abortion. The first one is rape. This is one of the most common things that people will come up to and say, we're going to have to get an abortion because I was raped. And that's what people will say, like, hey, abortion needs to be legal because what happens if raped? Well, here's the thing. Only less than 0.5% of all abortions are because of rape. Less than 0.5%. So if we're going to legalize abortion based on the possibility of rape, that is not even the majority of reasons why people are getting abortions in the first place. If it was, then we could maybe make a case for legalizing it because of rape, but this is not the case. This is not the majority of the reasons. Very, very small percentage. Also, an interesting perspective on people advocating for abortion because of rape, just to listen to this. The horror of this act is not in the life in your womb, but in the act that caused it. So the horror, because rape is a traumatic thing, is not in the act itself, or not in the life that's in the womb, but in the act that caused it. So the life, although it's a byproduct, the horror is not in the life. The horror is in the act that caused the actual rape. Also, incest. People say, let's get abortion because of incest, which, again, that's a small percentage of people that are doing it. Kind of a morbid thing to think about and a hard to swallow pill, but the child that's a result of incest is the best evidence against it, because usually there are abnormalities and deformations of the child, and that's kind of the best evidence against incest and why we don't need to have incestuous relationships. And a thought here is aborting the baby may promote the continuation of incest, because people know that they can get away with incestuous relationships because abortion is there, and that's always an option, so we can just abort the baby and keep doing what we're doing, which is kind of weird and kind of gross. A couple other reasons for abortions. The first, this is by the Guttmacher Institute from 2004. 25% people said that they just weren't ready to have a child. Another 23% said they couldn't afford a baby, so the financial burden there. 19% said they're just done having children in general. It's like, man, we were not trying to have another, and we did. We just don't want another one, so we're going to have an abortion. 8% of people said they don't want to be a single mother. 7% of people said they're not mature enough to have a baby. 4% of people, interesting, said it's going to interfere with their education or their career. And 13% selected other, get abortions for other reasons like rape, incest, and so on and so forth. A couple different ones here and there. I think that totals up to about 99% or so. In Florida, so that was the Guttmacher Institute 2004. This is some statistics of reasons for abortions from 2018, but just the state of Florida. 75.4% of people who got an abortion in Florida in 2018 said no reason was the reason for their abortion. Don't know if they just declined to answer, but 20% said social or economic reasons. 1.67% of people said women's psychological health. 1.48% said women's physical health. Look at that, super low numbers there. And then 1.42% said other reasons. So if this no reason at all was not a kind of just, I don't want to answer this question, and it was just, I just don't have a reason, I just want an abortion kind of thing, then this is very big clue into why people are getting abortions, which kind of goes in line, not as much with the previous slide, but yeah, check out these last two of the last three right here: psychological health and physical health. It's barely 3% of abortions in Florida because of psychological or physical health. And usually you would see people advocating for abortions because of physical health or mental health of the mother. So just a thought. So here's the question that we're getting into. When does life begin? I like this little picture. You had a Catholic priest saying at the moment of conception. You have a judge saying at birth. And then you have this teenager, college student person with like a sweater vest thing or whatever, eating a piece of pizza, or maybe a high schooler, probably a high schooler. When you get your driver's license, that's when life begins. So a couple of different arguments. We got 11 different phases or possibilities for when life begins. So let's get started. The first one is conception. This is immediate. It's the creation of new DNA. This happens as soon as the sperm and the egg, or the sperm goes in and all that stuff, and the egg, all that great stuff that happens. Outside of twins, no DNA is the same. So this could be a good evidence of DNA being created. Therefore, this is a new life. The argument against, however, is that 50% of all fertilized eggs never make it into the wall of the uterus. So we could have an argument against, because some of these fertilized eggs will not actually make it to will not actually make it to become living babies or anything like that. And so we could have kind of a So 50% of all fertilized eggs never make it to the wall of the uterus. That's a good argument against, because not every egg that is fertilized, or not every time conception occurs do we have a life resulting in it. And so people could argue against it as not necessarily conception. It'd have to be something different, which leads us to the second one. The second one's implantation, or this is whenever the fertilization of the eggs occurs. This is 12 to 14 days. This is whenever the egg makes it to the wall of the uterus. The fertilized egg makes it to the wall of the uterus, which means that there is a life beginning to be there. So a lot of people will side there if they're not going to go. If they're still conservative, they're not going to, but they don't want to go with conception, they might side with this one. A guy named Norman Geisler, who's a great Christian apologist, or was, he ended up passing away 2 years ago. He argues for this as his way of saying that this is when life begins. The third one is individuation. This is at 14 days. This is when twinning occurs. So if you're going to have twins that in the womb, this is whenever they would separate and begin to individuate. Makes sense? Individuation, twins. And a question to ask is, okay, if twins are occurring here in the separation of the twins, the separation of the bodies and stuff, if this occurs, then maybe this is whenever the soul enters the child. Just a thought to think about. The fourth one is the legal definition of life. This is when the head exits the womb, from Roe versus Wade, when the head exits the womb. So it's full term, 9 months or 40 weeks, whatever it is. However, so although the legal definition is when the head exits the womb, the state can begin protecting the fetus in the third trimester. However, there are exceptions to this. So it is frowned upon to have a third trimester abortion. Most abortions do occur well before the third trimester, well before the second, I would even say, early second or in the first. However, there have been abortions performed in the third trimester because of certain exceptions. Abortions after this point are allowed if the pregnancy could harm the mother. It's kind of what we're saying here. So exceptions, if the pregnancy is going to harm your mom or the mother, then abortions can be allowed in the third trimester if there are complications. But that's the legal definition, when the head exits the womb. Number 5, brain waves. This happens about 42 days in, 42, so a little over a month. Why do we argue for brain waves? Well, when we consider medical definitions of death, there are 2: irreversible cessation of the heart and lungs, and whole brain death. So if you have a person that has no brain waves going on at all, there's a medical definition that, according to the medical definition of death, they are dead because they have no brain waves going on. Whole brain death, the brain has stopped working. And so if we use that as a definition of death, the brain has stopped working, and we say brain waves have appeared in this baby, maybe a medical definition would be when the brain starts to function and have brain waves occur, and thoughts, thinking, and circulating, all that stuff. Neurological impulses happen during this period as well. So that's brain waves. Number 6 is viability. That's around 20 weeks. Some people would say it's a little later, but we have seen a couple children live outside the womb. So viability means when the baby can live outside the womb. How viable is it? Can it live? Can it survive without being attached to the environment of the womb? So it's about 20 weeks, but some could be shorter, some could be a little longer. Generalizations are all general. Not every situation is the same. It could be 19. We've even seen a birth at 19 weeks, which is crazy. That's super, super early if you did not know. But we would like to see babies go full term because it does provide some complications. Number 7, life in the blood. So when blood appears, this is from Leviticus 17:11. You would see that there is life in the blood is a phrase that is repeated in Scripture. And so we can deduce from this, since life is in the blood, life does not exist until blood occurs. Interesting thought. This is in the 2nd month, so not the 1st month, so about 30 plus days in, you'll start to see blood occur in the baby's body or the fetus. Number 8, we have a weird one, 28 days after birth. Kind of weird, but here's the thought. Stay with me. Don't just write this one off. Stay with me. A guy named Peter Singer, one of the greatest ethicists of our time. He's on, if you go into any YouTube videos, type in Peter Singer. He's an atheist, but he's got a lot of interesting thoughts, interesting ideas. So he says that we should not consider a child legally alive until 28 days outside the womb. Here's a quote. From the point of view of ethics, rather than the law, there is no sharp distinction between the fetus and the newborn baby. Interesting. So whether the baby's in the womb or the baby is in a hospital bed, there's no distinction, no sharp distinction between. So we should be able to have a little bit longer period. This would extend the woman's and the man's choice to outside the womb if you want to take the baby's life or not. And the majority of babies that die because of birth defects die within 28 days. So this is where the 28 comes from. So if there is a birth defect in the baby, it would die within 28 days. So Peter Singer says, okay, we should have the right to abort a baby and kill a baby 28 days after birth. The second one, or the 9th one, is 3 days after birth. This is a guy named James Watson. He helped find the DNA, which is kind of interesting, but he advocates for 3 days after birth is when life begins. Number 10 is self-consciousness. This occurs around 2 years old, which is really late in the game. But that is self-consciousness. So whenever you become self-aware, we could say life begins there. Some people do actually say that. And then number 11, biblical evidence, which we see in the 6th month. Where do we see this? In Luke 1:41, we see the humanity of John the Baptist. It's clear right about the 6th month. We see John leaping in the womb whenever Mary arrives, and he's in Elizabeth's belly. And it's kind of like evidence that at least John recognized the presence of Mary, who was carrying Jesus at the time, and he leaped in the womb. So it was an interesting story for sure, but there might be some biblical evidence that life does begin in the womb, especially with that story in the 6th month. Doesn't make clear where in the process, but maybe it does begin in the womb. So where do you stand? Which definition of when life begins do you agree with? Why? Why not? And what if you're wrong and it's later? And what if it's earlier? What happens then? Thank you so much for watching. Peace.